Hi, welcome to N5.4 Estimation. This outcome asks you to develop and apply personal strategies for estimation and computation. So estimation means that you're making a guess based on some facts, and computation means that you're doing all the math. There are three main strategies right here: front-end rounding, compensation, and compatible numbers. So we'll talk about those in a minute. As always, they want you to apply it to real life, your family, or yourself. So we'll be able to show you some examples of that. Develop your own strategies. So you might pick a favorite from one of those, or you might have a combination of one of those strategies. And this is just with whole numbers. So we're not using decimals or fractions just yet with estimation. Critique the statement. Critique means just tell whether you think it's true or not. An estimate is never good enough. So we'll see, maybe there's some times where it is good enough and there's some times where you would never want to estimate. Identify and describe situations relevant to self. Again, they love that one, self. Determine an approximate solution, not requiring an exact answer. So they've given some examples here, and I've got a few more. They said number of fish, so you're not actually going to count every fish in the ocean. You would probably take an estimate. Deer, elk, required to feed a family over winter, the amount of money a family spends on groceries, so lots of good examples of where we can estimate. Explain the strategies, and it just lists the three again. Identify a strategy used in problem solving. Apply and explain the choice of estimation or computation strategy. So if you could explain it, that would work too for this outcome. So let's have a look. Okay, front-end estimation is simply looking at the first number that you've got. So if I'm going to add 589 plus 207, I would simply look at the front end, add those two, and call it a day. So front-end estimation is not overly accurate if you're just using the front end and you're not looking at what's left in the number. Okay, because 89 is quite close to 100. So 589 is probably more like 600 than it is like 500, right? And so 207, well, that's pretty close to 200. When you add those, you actually get 800. So front-end rounding can be a good strategy, but if you've got numbers that would indicate that you should round up, it isn't going to be very accurate. However, there's some strategies that you can use to sort of make it a little bit more accurate. One other thing with front-end estimation, you have to remember place value. You've got hundreds, you've got tens, you've got ones, right? And so if you have a number like 85 and you're going to add a number like 150, remember where the place values lie, because you would never want to put something like this and then front end estimate and say, oh, that's 900. Because 150 plus 85 is not anywhere close to 900. So make sure that you're putting your place values correctly before you do any kind of gathering of the front ends. Okay, let's have a look down here at the green chalkboard. They've given some examples: 44,859, 25,789. They've said that they're just using that, and then the rest of the digits are zeros. So they've turned it into, over here, 40,000. Then they've done the same thing here, just simple front-end rounding, and they've turned that into 20,000, giving us a total of 60,000. So we can use front-end rounding if we're just eyeballing it. If we need something just sort of in the ballpark, nothing too exact, we could just do front-end rounding and that would be good enough. However, to make it a little bit more accurate, you can go back to your original numbers and front end round again, except this time, let's use the thousands. Okay, so that would be 4,000, and that would be 5,000, giving us a 9 here. So we're getting a little bit more accurate, aren't we? 69,000 as opposed to 60,000. Okay, you can also round up. I'm just going to change color here. You can take that original number of 44,859. Maybe you just want to front end round based on those 2 digits that you see right there. And so you'd be saying 44 plus 25, which is what we just did, right? Okay, let's look at the other example. If you're going to use front-end rounding, this is kind of similar to what we just did. They rounded all this purple stuff. They rounded those first, and they said, well, $1 and $1 and $2, that's $4 so far. And then they took the cents, and they said, well, I'm just going to change colors. 10 cents, that's already in a pretty good shape for rounding, so they just kept it as 10 cents. 73 cents, they called that 70 cents, and again 71 cents, they said 70. And then they added the coins, and they found that 70 and 70 is 140, plus that 10 is 150. So now they can add the 4 and the 150, and that gives them a very accurate answer of 550. So you can front end round or front end estimate, but you can use different place values and get yourself a more accurate answer. The next strategy is compensation. So compensation is handy when you have a big number and a small number. So for example, if I'm adding 589 plus 635. Okay, if we were just going to use front end rounding, we would say 500 plus 600 is 1100. Right? But to be a little bit more accurate, we can say, well, this is big enough to tell that guy to round up. The 3 is not big enough to make the 6 do anything. Okay, so already we've gotten a more accurate answer because we rounded one of them up and one of them down. So this might be useful if you have a batch of things, and let's say you've got 5, 7, 9, 9, and 2. You might be able to do a quick eyeball and say, well, that's 10, and that's 10, and that's 10. Okay, so I rounded 5 and 7 down to 10. I rounded the 9 up to 10, and I rounded this 11 down to 10. And then I did 10 plus 10 plus 10 gave me the 30. So compensation is great because you can have a more accurate answer just by rounding one of them up and one of them down. Or maybe one of them down and 2 of them up like I did, or 2 of them down, 1 of them up in the last example. All right, next one. Compatible numbers. This is something actually I use all the time. I'm always trying to get the numbers that I'm using to a 10 or a 5 because these are happy numbers that are easy to add. Okay, so the definition here says numbers in a problem that are related in a way that are easy to work with mentally. Well, I can add tens and I can multiply tens in my head. That's very easy. And so if you have a question like okay, you can round this guy maybe to 70 or to 80. doesn't matter. Let's go with 80, since the 5 is big enough to tell the 7 what to do. So we know that 8 times 4 is 32, and we need the 0 because there's a 0 in the question. And so when we brought the 75 to a number that had a 0 in it, it became much easier to work with. So you would never round your 75 to a 76 and try and multiply that, because that doesn't make your question any easier, right? Sometimes you have questions like this. I would round this to 25. Why? Because it's more accurate than going to 20. And I can do 25s in my head because I always think of money. So if I have 3/4, I have 75 cents. So that to me is a compatible number because it's easy to work with, because we work with it all the time with money. The example that they've given us on the screen here, 720 and 90 are compatible numbers for division because the 72 and the 9 work out to 8. So we know that 720 divided by 9 is 8 with the 0, because we have 1 0 here, so we have 1 0 here. So finding compatible numbers, usually you're looking for 10s and 5s, but not always. Sometimes you're looking for numbers that you're familiar with as well. Okay, so why estimate in the first place? Well, it's going to save you some time. This construction worker down in the corner, he knows he needs a certain amount of bricks to build this building. But is he going to count every single brick in his construction plan, and instead of estimating, he would have the exact number of bricks and that's all he would ever order? There would be none left over whatsoever. So that's probably very time consuming. He could do it, but it would take forever, and really he can take back the extra bricks, so it's no big deal. So estimating for him saves a lot of time. Sometimes close enough is good enough. So if you're going to count these dudes over here, well, they're on the move. You're not going to catch everyone. Some of them might be sleeping in the bushes, even if you're driving around in your helicopter or use a drone to see what the deer population is one winter. You are probably not going to catch every single one of them. You might estimate high, you might estimate low, but close enough is good enough. You don't need to know the exact number of deer in Saskatchewan. You need to just know a good estimation. Deer are also impossible to count. The jelly beans, impossible to count. You can't see what's on the inside layer. So sometimes you just don't have access to those kinds of things. The swimming pool, also impossible to count. You could measure out every liter of water and then dump it in the pool. But then we're going back to the time issue. Also with your pool water, close enough is good enough. When the pool looks sort of full, they will shut the tap off. Lastly, financial estimates down here. If you have, let's say you're going to have some work done on your car, you're going to ask for an estimate. So the mechanic or the body shop or whatever would calculate, they would sit down and work out the numbers and think, well, this much for your engine and this much for your filters and this much for labor, and they would give you a rough idea of what it's going to cost. Then you can make an informed decision if you want to have the work done or not, because sometimes your estimate is much more than you were expecting. So financial estimates are really nice to have, and most businesses that do work like that would provide an estimate. Hopefully they would provide that estimate for free. Shouldn't cost you anything to have them look at it. Not so with your vehicle. Most mechanics will charge you to open the hood, so you'll have to watch out for that. But it's nice to have an estimate, because you wouldn't want to take your vehicle to the shop, have them do all this work, and then find out afterwards that the cost is far more than what you thought it was going to be. So when they give you an estimate, they're usually bound by that number. They have to give you the price that they've estimated, give or take. It might be a little higher, a little lower, but at least you're informed of what you're in for. Okay, so then our last question here is, why round up? When would be a good time to overestimate? Well, I would say for the construction worker, he should overestimate a little bit. He should get a bit of extra brick, because if he doesn't and they all run out of bricks, you have this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy that is now standing around doing nothing, and that will cost him money because he has to pay those workers while he's waiting for extra bricks to arrive. So in his case, it would be better to overestimate. In the case of your vehicle, I think it would be smart of the business to overestimate a little bit so that they're giving you what they feel is going to be the maximum price. So they can say, okay, it might be less than this, it should be less than this, but you won't pay more than $5,000 or whatever their estimate is. So sometimes it's really handy to overestimate. All right, happy estimating.